Good evening, everyone, and this is my presentation for the 2021 SCAPPS Research Conference. My presentation is going to be on should disease duration be linked to freezing of gait and Parkinson's disease. So freezing of gait is a sudden occurrence when an individual is temporarily unable to move their feet forward, even though they're trying their hardest to walk. And it is one of the most debilitating symptoms of Parkinson's disease. It increases the chances of falls, which also increases the chances of injury and leads to a loss of independence from the patient. Now, it's important to note that not all patients with Parkinson's develop freezing. Only about 30% of them do so. When someone develops freezing, it usually happens without much warning signs, which is why it's important to predict who will become a freezer in the future after being diagnosed with Parkinson's, since this will allow for intervention strategies to either reduce the severity of the freezing episodes or perhaps even prevent them from becoming a freezer altogether. It has been a long-standing assumption that the longer an individual has had the disease for, the more likely they are to develop freezing. The way this assumption was acquired was by people looking at all of the freezing-related studies that has been done in the past. And what they would do is they would compare the disease duration between the freezers and non-freezers. And what they would find was that um, the, the participants that have had the disease for a longer period of time would end up being the ones that were freezers as compared to the non-freezers. The problem with this was that in most of these studies, freezing of gait and disease duration were only secondary measures that were being looked at in these studies. Additionally, no statistical correlations were measured between these two variables to actually find an association between them. Additionally, in most of these studies, freezing was self-reported. And this is problematic because sometimes someone might claim that they have freezing of gait, but when they're actually clinically assessed by a neurologist, it ends up being something else, like shuffling or rigidity, or maybe even another disease altogether. So the purpose of this study is to observe the strength of the contribution of disease duration in determining who becomes a freezer. So to do so, demographic information for 160 patients was taken using the database at the MDRC. These patients consisted of freezers, non-freezers, and people that were originally non-freezers but later on converted into freezers. It is important to note that demographic information was taken at the time of the participants' first ever assessment at the MDRC. So as you can see from this table here, this summarizes how these 160 participants were divided into their groups. So group 1 would be the 26 converters that were originally non-freezers since their first time at the MDRC and eventually eventually converted into freezers since their last assessment at the MDRC. Group 2 would be the non-freezers that were non-freezers at the time of their first assessment and still remain non-freezers since their last assessment at the MDRC. Group 3 would be the freezers that were already freezers since their first assessment at the MDRC. So when a participant comes to the MDRC to participate in a study, a UPDRS and gait assessment is done at the start of the study. Now, most of these participants, their first assessment occurred between 2010 and 2015, and most patients participate in at least 1 to 2 studies a year. So this is how we were able to confirm that the participants in group 1 actually converted to freezers later on, and it's also how we're able to confirm that the participants in group 2 have yet to convert to a freezer since their last ever assessment at the MDRC. In addition, correlations and eta coefficients were computed using SPSS for disease duration and freezing of gait to find an association between these two variables. So when disease duration was used as the dependent variable and freezing of gait state was used as the independent variable, the eta value was 0.354, which shows a moderate association between disease duration and freezing of gait state. There was a 12.5% coefficient of determination, which means that 12.5% of the variance of the disease duration can be accounted for by freezing of gait states. Now, when the freezing of gait state was used as the dependent variable and disease duration was used as the independent variable, the eta value was 0.258. Now, this shows a weak association between disease duration and freezing of gait state. The coefficient of determination is 6.66%, so that means that 6.66% of the variance of freezing of gait state can be determined by the duration of the disease. So in conclusion, we do see a slight association between freezing of gait and disease duration. However, it is unlikely that a patient becomes a freezer strictly because of increased disease duration. It's possible that some patients were already genetically predisposed to becoming a freezer and just need a certain amount of time to develop it. In addition, some patients were never genetically predisposed to becoming a freezer and will never develop freezing regardless of how long they've had the disease for. So future research should focus on identifying variables that can predict who will become a freezer in their lifetime. So over the past couple of months at the MDRC, we've actually been using gait as a potential biomarker for freezing in Parkinson's disease. And again, the gait data from the patient's first ever assessment was used, and using machine learning, we analyzed the data of these participants, and some variables of interest that we found was mean stride length, increase in variance of stride length, increase in standard deviation of stride time, mean stride velocity, increase in variance of stride velocity, and an increase in variance of step time and step length. While the machine learning model was accurate in identifying patients that were going to convert from a non-freezer to a freezer, more research is still needed for these variables to be used as a potential tool in predicting future freezers. Thank you guys all for your time, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.